This is the primary season element 2 about the holy grail for any political party, the National Convention. Since January of that election year, you've dreamed of it, stopping at every town along the way. You've taken the time to meet with people one-on-one to convince them that you are the person that their party should nominate for president. You've rallied people around you to believe in you and your cause and your ideas. You've won over the crowd with inspirational speeches. You've gotten out among the people and shaken their hands to let them know you're just like them, even the weird ones. You've done the little song and dance and all the other things that you swore you'd never do to try to get a vote. And, of course, you kissed some babies, even if they didn't always like it. You've successfully worked the crowds and become admired by the people, becoming a master at the campaigning that politicians must do and have always done. You started out among the many and survived long enough to enter the summer as one of the few. You've done every single thing possible to relate to the people and convince them that you're the man for any job. And now, around late July, early August of that election year, after 8 months on the road, you deserve a party, and it's called the National Convention. But by then, there's really no suspense. John McCain in 2008 knew he was going to be the Republican Party's nominee for president, because if you look at the map here, you see that he'd won most of the Republican primaries. Those states where he won the primaries were going to send delegates to the National Convention that were obviously going to vote for him. And the same was true for Barack Obama in the Democratic Party primaries of 2008, although he had to sweat it out a little bit longer than John McCain did. Mathematically, McCain knew in May or so that he was going to be the Republican Party's nominee for president, but on the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton was still winning states and making a strong push well into the summer. Some leaders in the Democratic Party thought, well, Obama's going to get the nomination, and we don't want to look divided as a party. It would look bad to the voters. So they convinced Hillary Clinton to drop out and throw her full support behind Barack Obama. But it wasn't until then that Obama knew for sure that he was going to be the party's nominee, and yet it was still before the Democratic Party convention. But it's even nicer if you're an incumbent president. In 2012, Barack Obama had already been in office for 4 years at that point, so nobody in the Democratic Party was seriously going to challenge him for the nomination. Now, technically they could, and the Democrats did have somewhat of a very loose primary season, but when you're a sitting president, you're probably going to get your party's nomination. But either way, whether you're a sitting president or somebody who won the primaries, it's nice to get there and know that you don't really have to worry about it. Now, this is the Republican National Convention, and it was held in late July 2012 as per presidential election tradition. They were the challenging party, so they went first and had their convention before the Democrats did. The Democrats, meanwhile, as the party with the sitting president, had their convention a couple weeks later in early August, and of course in a different city. That's always been a part of presidential election tradition, that the challenging party goes first and the sitting party goes second. Now, political conventions aren't held in the same cities every year, and the Republicans and Democrats certainly are rarely, if ever, going to have their political conventions in the same city. Here's a map of all the different cities up to 2004 that have hosted the Republican or Democratic national conventions. Of course, the years listed in red are years that that city held the Republican convention, and the years listed in blue are the years that the Democrats' national convention was in that city. As you can see here, Philadelphia and Chicago are very popular sites. There's also one other important thing to remember about political conventions, whether we really want to admit it or not, and that's that they're pretty scripted and choreographed. Now, the main reason for that is because it's supposed to be a celebration of the party, its policies, its candidates, everything like that. They're supposed to provide an image of unity to the American people that they will buy into in the November general election. And therefore, campaigns, or political conventions, I should say, tend to be a little bit scripted, as you can see from this political cartoon, or these two cartoons here. It's not that everybody necessarily likes it that way, but it is just kind of how it is for public image. Pause this slide right here and take a look at this political cartoon. But even with that, a national convention is a big political party in every sense of the word, giving every Democrat and every Republican a chance to celebrate who they are and all their friends around them. Now, the convention is 4 days long, and day one is the kickoff of the entire event, usually starting with a roll call of the delegates. But again, more than anything, day one is about celebrating the heritage of your party and all the things that you believe in, and that usually involves bringing in a keynote speaker to fire up the crowd. Now, in some occasions, it'll be somebody who's a legend in your political party, in this case, Bill Clinton, who was elected in 1992 and 1996, and despite scandals, also presided over one of the most prosperous economic time periods we ever had, and is therefore beloved by the Democratic Party. Especially because Bill Clinton has always been a very eloquent speaker. So you bring somebody like that in as a keynote speaker to fire up the crowd, and then acknowledge that he is not the most important person in the room anymore, that he's passing the torch on to the younger generation. Moments like these are just other ways to celebrate the history and show the unity of your political party. But your keynote speaker doesn't necessarily have to be someone that's from the party's past. A lot of times, your keynote speaker can be someone there to show how great the party could be in the future. The point is to fire up the crowd about how great the party is in its history, its beliefs, and everything else. After the keynote speakers, there's usually going to be a series of other speakers who are invited in to say great things about the party. Here's former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm speaking at the Democratic National Convention. And sometimes they're brought in to reestablish party unity. Remember that in 2008, Hillary Clinton was still giving Barack Obama a pretty good push well into the summer before the Democratic National Convention. And you don't want to go into a presidential election with your party looking like it's divided. It doesn't look good to the voters. So if you remember, she dropped out, Obama took off and got the nomination, and then she showed up at the Democratic National Convention to throw her full support behind Barack Obama. It was a very solid political move by the Democratic Party. Day one is also going to involve having the spouse of your, we'll call it a potential nominee because it's not official yet, come in and say great things about the character of the person that you've selected and why you should be happy that you decided to support him. Here's Mitt Romney's wife, Ann, at the Republican National Convention, and Michelle Obama about to speak at the Democratic National Convention, also on their day one. Hollywood stars are also popular choices on day one because they're familiar faces that can give testimonials for the candidate as well. Here's Clint Eastwood at the Republican National Convention, and Scarlett Johansson speaking at the Democratic National Convention. And to close out the celebration on day one and keep the party going, there's usually going to be some kind of band. Here's Tommy Blades playing at the Republican National Convention, and Foo Fighters playing at the Democratic National Convention. Now, day two is usually a little bit more serious and down to business because this is when they establish the party platform. To help explain this, I want you to think back to the political ideology lesson and the self-survey that I had you do. There I gave you 25 social issues and I asked you to decide if you were more liberal, more moderate, or more conservative on each one of those particular issues. Well, that's essentially the same thing that the party does when they put together the party platform. Issues like right to life and issues like marriage, traditional versus modern, or health care, or the Second Amendment, and pretty much every other issue under the sun. A party platform occupies anywhere from 50 to 150 pages. I have a couple examples in the room if you ever want to see them. But the bottom line here is that this is the party coming out and saying, this is what we believe. This is our political ideology. Of course, as you can imagine, the Democrats are going to be a little bit more liberal, and the Republicans are going to be a little bit more conservative. But this is the party's official statement about what they believe and what they expect their candidate to uphold if they become president. And it's called the party platform. But as important as the party platform is, day three is the day that everybody is there to see. Day three is when you officially select the person who is going to be the nominee of your party, the person who gets your party's nomination to run for President of the United States in the upcoming general election. And it usually starts off with the chairman of your political party's national committee going from state to state to let the state brag about themselves. And I've heard states in this deal talk about everything from sporting events to agricultural might and industrial history and anything they have to be proud of. They'll brag about it. Every time they do, their delegation will cheer and clap and everything else, and they'll get done giving their spiel about how proud of themselves they are, and then they'll finish with, select as our nominee for the next President of the United States, and then they'll give the name. And everybody cheers, everybody claps for themselves, big celebration, and then the chair says, okay, next state, and it all starts all over again. But if you ever get a chance to watch it, it is kind of fun. You'd be surprised at the stuff they come up with. And so each state gets to brag a little bit, be proud of who they are, and then just come right out and say the obvious, that the person who won their primary, or caucus, if they're a caucus state in that party, they get to come right out and say that that person is the one who is going to be their choice, the person that they would like to see get their party's nomination to run for President of the United States. Now, in this particular case, in the Republican primary, of course, Mitt Romney knew fairly early on, I think it was June, that he was eventually going to get the nomination, and so all the states that were states where he had won primary elections were all excited to go there and just state the obvious. But what about a state where somebody else won, like Rick Perry? If Rick Perry won a Republican primary in a state, well, then that state might decide not to send delegates to the national convention that were going to support Rick Perry. It would look bad for party loyalty and party unity, so if they knew that Mitt Romney was going to get the nomination anyway, they might grab the people in that state who had voted for Mitt Romney and send them instead. Remember, the idea is party unity and party loyalty and making the party look good. See, it's all by design. When it's all said and done, the product you want to show to the American people at your convention, especially on day 3, is that your party is unified and that they're all behind the candidate that you've selected. And therefore, it's also important to make sure that the person who won the most primaries, or caucuses if you're a caucus state, it's important to make sure that that person is the one who gets the nomination on day 3. If there's anything other than that that makes it look like there's any disunity in the party, that looks bad going into the general election. And so, in 2012, Mitt Romney was announced as the Republican Party's nominee for President of the United States. And a couple weeks later, on day 3 of the Democratic Party's national convention, Barack Obama was announced as their candidate to be re-elected as President of the United States. And as for day 4, the last day of the convention, well, that really might be the only surprise day. That day is when they choose the vice presidential candidate. And frankly, the outside world really doesn't know who that's going to be. It's really up to the candidate and the leading political advisors for the party behind the scenes. In 2012, Mitt Romney chose Paul Ryan as his vice presidential candidate, somebody who had ran against him in the primaries and made a strong showing. And on day 4 at the Democratic National Convention, Barack Obama selected Joe Biden once again to be his vice presidential candidate. I think it's important to note here as well that when you choose a vice presidential candidate, you're trying to engage in ticket splitting. In other words, you're trying to find somebody opposite of you to gain the most votes that you can. You have Barack Obama, a young black man from a northern state with not much foreign policy experience, who chooses Joe Biden, an older white southerner who has a lot of foreign policy experience. This is a common practice throughout presidential politics and history. And with that, the convention is done. Time to get the standing ovation from the crowd. Have the families come up to be recognized and be seen in front of everybody to show some unity. Have the vice presidential candidate and the presidential candidate's families give each other hugs. Look up at the ceiling and cue the balloon drop with the confetti. And celebrate a job well done as you now prepare to face the other party in the championship game, the November general election. That's it. Thanks for listening.